Today's video is about 8 signs that you may have a more avoidant attachment pattern. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and this series I'm calling the SAGE sessions is really sort of like how to prime someone to understand themselves, their childhood and adult lives through the lens of sort of the tenets of therapy, things like attachment and trauma and neurodivergence and all of those things. And so this particular one today is one of 4 attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. And I chose to start with avoidant because it feels like this is the one that people seek to understand that they don't understand in many regards, because they do cause a lot of the dynamics and drama in relationships and dating. And there is some research, and some people believe that the dating pool is actually full of people with a more avoidant attachment pattern. And I was just thinking, when you think about generations, especially like the Gen X generation, it would make a lot of sense for something like avoidance to be even maybe more dominant than something like anxious attachment. But I don't have the research on that specifically, but it is interesting to think about how parenting styles and patterns of raising children can maybe foster or encourage one style or another. So in this style, we're talking about something defined by what is often used in the really deep attachment literature. Repeated maternal rejection is the core dynamic. And it doesn't necessarily mean you were rejected. What it means is that the child's bids for connection, the child's attempts to engage in collaborative, responsive caregiving, were often met by a parent who dismissed those bids for connection and in which the child interprets as rejection. So the idea is that very early on, these kids learn that, you know what, I'm not necessarily going to get my needs met by being needy and clingy and crying or angry. In fact, the opposite is true. The more independent and autonomous I am, because I've learned to be, the more likely I am to receive positive, whatever that is, connection in whatever form with my caregiver. And as I've said also in many videos, don't forget, this comes essentially from John Bowlby's work and Mary Ainsworth's work, especially on the strange situation as we talk about these styles and how we look at adult relationships. Because don't forget, the concept here is that attachment theory describes the earliest infant's experience, the infant's earliest experiences in the world with caregivers, and how that interplay goes back and forth, and how that becomes the internal template or map for how we believe love and relationships and reciprocity and safety and connection and communication and vulnerability, what all of that looks like. So when you're thinking about avoidant attachment and you're saying, okay, these kids learned early on, for example, in a strange situation, these were the infants who at times, when mommy and baby went into the research room with toys that was new to them, and a researcher and a stranger came in, they weren't that fazed by the stranger potentially, actually. And essentially, when mom left the room, many of them just followed her with their eyes and watched her leave. They didn't melt down. They didn't get, clingy and desperate, because they had already learned that that doesn't work. But when they measured their heart rates and cortisol and all the things that were happening internally, many of these babies were just as distressed on the inside as the babies who were melting down on the outside. So these are going to be adults who often do the same thing. They might look cool as a cucumber on the outside to you, and on the inside there can be a lot more going on. But as a result of all of that, they tend to engage in certain patterns around themselves and relationships. So the first sign is that if you have a more avoidant attachment pattern, it's very likely that you experienced a more emotionally neglectful environment in which your parent didn't necessarily do out loud, walk on eggshells, anger, sadness. They were more likely to be absent, to be disengaged, to be maybe give you the silent treatment, to not ask about your feelings. So it's very unlikely that if you have a solely more avoidant attachment pattern, you didn't necessarily have eggshell caregivers. You had the opposite. It was like an environment often devoid, especially of negative emotions. Number 2, your parent created, rewarded, you experienced, or it was expected for you to be independent. They were like, yay, look how great you are on your own, playing alone, autonomous. There was a reason and a reward for being independent. And at the end of the day, you had to be. And so you often learn to care for yourself, but that is seen as a very positive trait by your caregivers. Number 3, you learned very early to deactivate your attachment needs. Whenever you felt emotional, needy, or vulnerable, you shut it down because you already learned most likely that crying it out or having a fit or tantrum didn't work. And so things like emotional intimacy and vulnerability, you often shut down in yourself. In receiving from others, you might tune it out, not know how to validate it or invalidate your own emotions that way, and or you only let yourself experience these things alone. Number 4, you are not necessarily played with, and I don't think historically parents played with their kids a lot. At the end of the day, though, it wasn't like you engaged in a lot of collaboration, even if it was like cooking together, interacting together, playing board games together. The chances are pretty high that you were doing a lot of things alone and you sort of didn't get engaged with in a very reciprocal, collaborative way. And don't forget that, play is a child's work. And so even if it was, watching you play something or engaging, these parents were often not really participating in that. The next one is you feel safest when you have boundaries, when things are clear, when you're controlling things, when you're disconnected from too much enmeshment or emotionality. And so you often set up your life that way where it feels like you're inflexible, you're rigid, or you're sort of conditional about things because that is how you took care of yourself and stayed safe. And so you often apply that to other people with no real tolerance for that kind of, boundaryless, open, too touchy-feely kind of woo-woo stuff. Often that feels really unsafe for you. And it can trigger things inside that you also don't want to feel. So you might also shut that down. Number 6, you often have a deep longing. You really often do want to be seen, want to feel connected with somebody, but it feels so foreign and unsafe. So your longing is there, but your need to protect yourself is greater. And so those two are often, you're sort of wrestling with those, but if you're very harshly in the avoidant camp and you're not working on it, you will always choose your own safety over the couple or the safety of the we in the relationship. And the safety meaning emotional safety, essentially. Number 7, you often surprise yourself at the beginning of a relationship. You can be sort of anxious and engaged and feel like I'm really secure, like I'm able to express how I feel. But as things get deeper and more emotion gets involved, you often find yourself deactivating from attachment. You often find yourself sabotaging connection and pulling back and getting rigid again. And so many of you know this around this one, especially this style, too much closeness is not safe. And so even though in the beginning it's like, oh, I can do this, when it starts to get real, you tend to back away in some regard or in a significant way. And then lastly, you're a big self-soother. Whether you binge watch, binge eat, numb, dissociate, use substances, have addiction issues, and or being alone is one of the ways you do, manage all of these feelings to self-soothe. And I've talked a lot about people having this, activated nervous system, that being alone is the only time you feel safe. And that is often true for avoidance as well, that too much demand from others creates this longing for isolation to manage it. And often, remember, you were alone. Maybe you were left to cry it out in your crib or your room, or you played a lot in your room, going back to what I was saying about our generation. So there is something about being alone that feels inherently soothing to the self. And there's nothing wrong with that in any regard, unless it is depression, unless it prohibits true connection or friendship, you want it to change, things like that. But even being alone, you might numb out with things. Like on the one hand, you feel safe alone, but when you really feel your aloneness, that also triggers your vulnerability. So you find ways to often distract and self-soothe from those. So those are often the common signs of avoidant attachment. And of course, there are more, but essentially we have this piece where we learned very early on to shut down our vulnerability and needs, and then to engage in strategies to try to manage all the vulnerability that brings up in us, in the world, in relationships, etc. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe and well. I'll talk a lot more about attachment. This is one of my favorite absolute topics. I'm going to talk tomorrow about 8 signs of more anxious attachment, and we'll keep going with disorganized and things like that. But remember that doing this work can be helped through therapy, through books, through podcasts, through really being motivated, if you have the style, to challenge yourself to tolerate closeness and connection and risk, because it can feel so antithetical to who you are and how you are in the world. But at the end of the day, if you don't change this and you want to be in a relationship, you will end up pushing people away because it will just feel like too much for you. And so those who I have seen be successful in therapy are often very honest with themselves, very motivated to challenge when they want to run, to lean in, to look at their judgments, rigidities. Remember, this style often does a lot of things to deactivate attachment, like over-focusing on imperfections in relationships and pining for the one that got away and always thinking the next one is going to be better or prettier or smarter or more handsome or whatever. They do a lot of things that are often unconscious until they become conscious. So make sure you're aware of those. All right. Thank you for being here. Have a good day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.